अच्छा ठीक है समझ गए. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for being here today. I'm Indrani Bagchi with the Ananta Center. Today we have a very special event, and I'm really happy that all of you have made time to come here in person. I'm even more grateful to our speakers from different countries across the world who have given up on sleep or on getting to work, depending on where they are, to be present here. So I'd like to begin. The tragic assassination of the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe not only shocked the world, but it prompted a reflection on how many geopolitical alignments have changed because Shinzo Abe was imagining a different future. Certainly, India lost a friend. From the first strategic partnership with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2006 to the special partnership between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe, the Japan-India relationship straddles and overcomes all political divides in India, and that's what makes it so special. The Modi-Abe friendship has been on full display, and we've seen absolutely heartwarming pictures of the two prime ministers building this really special personal bond over the past few years. In fact, Prime Minister Modi delivered the most heartfelt personal tribute to Prime Minister Abe in Bhawan just the other evening. We at Ananta Center too have lost a friend. Over the past 15 years, our Japan portfolio has grown enormously, from strategic dialogues to MP visits to business dialogues to young people's dialogues. Ananta has worked very hard to establish deep bonds with our partners in Japan. Prime Minister Abe was a staunch supporter of our work and was always available for our delegations whenever they visited Japan, making time to meet them, talk to them about the outcome of the dialogues, offer suggestions and ideas. Our panel here today are the torchbearers of Abe's vision and legacy. I am deeply grateful to each and every one of them for making the time for this event. We would like to begin with two special video messages from two special persons. Yohei Sasakawa, chairman of the Nippon Foundation and our partner in Japan, will deliver the first message. Can we play that, please?
Excellencies and friends at Ananta Aspen Center, good afternoon. Thank you for holding this memorial service for former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, whose life was cut short by a gunman's handmade bullet. Mrs. Abe will certainly be touched by your thoughtful gesture. The former Prime Minister was a great statesman representing Japan and highly esteemed around the world. He is a great loss to all, as seen by messages of condolence that arrived from leaders of more than 250 countries, regions, and international organizations. Mr. Abe pursued proactive diplomacy. As an example, he launched his long-term vision of free and open Indo Pacific strategy, making alliances and partnerships throughout the region, aiming to bring stability and prosperity to the world. This policy had the support of many countries, including India and the United States. I can only imagine his regret at losing his life so tragically, just as Japan was about to push ahead with his signature initiative. Let me now focus specifically on Japan-India relations. The government of India declared a day of state mourning as a mark of deepest respect. And Prime Minister Modi's touching words of tribute and condolence are all widely reported in Japan. As you are all aware that this close relationship between the leaders of India and Japan is but further strengthened the bilateral friendly ties, cementing larger cooperative partnership in trade, defense, and security. Many foreign dignitaries have visited Japan, but only Prime Minister Modi received invitation to Abe's villa in the foothills of Mount Fuji. This shows the close personal bond between the two, and furthermore, how much Japan sees India as an important friend. Let us together carry forward the legacy of Mr. Abe. Our effort will be to further strengthening Japan-India relations and for the stability, prosperity, and peace of the region. This, I believe, is the best way to honor the deceased soul of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe.
Thank you. We also persuaded Michael Green, who, as Director of Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, worked very closely with Prime Minister Abe, but also helped us when we were building our own relationship with Japan. He was in transit between Australia and the US, but very sweetly took out time to send us this message. Can we play that?
I'm Michael Green, the CEO of the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney in Australia, and until recently, Senior Vice President for Asia at CSIS in Washington, and before that, on the staff of the National Security Council in the White House under President George W. Bush. I am honored to be able to share my thoughts on former Prime Minister of Japan, Abe Shinzo. As many have said, the most consequential Japanese leader in recent history, perhaps one of the most consequential leaders in the Indo Pacific of this era. Abe was these things because he had a vision and the persistence and the patience to see it through. The idea of a free and open Indo Pacific, bringing together major maritime democracies like the US, Japan, Australia, India, was not new to Abe. It has roots going back to 19th century American thinkers like Commodore Perry and Alfred Thayer Mahan, and in Japanese thinking going back to the Meiji period as well. But Abe Shinzo was the leader who had the persistence, the political acumen, and the relationships to make this a vision, not only for Japan's new era of foreign policy, but for all of us. We now all refer to this region and to our strategic framing of the problems we face around the idea of the Indo-Pacific. And this is Abe's legacy as much as anything. He transformed Japanese strategy. He also transformed Japanese political leadership. His reinterpretation of Article 9 of the Constitution, his establishment of a National Security Council system in Japan, have changed forever the way that Japanese leaders will approach the world. Japanese people now expect their leaders to lead when there's a crisis facing not only Japan, but the global system. And you can see that in how Abe-san's successor, Prime Minister Kishida, has stepped up and led in the current crisis in Ukraine. This transformation was something I described in a book I published in March about Abe-san's grand strategy in this new era of geopolitical rivalry in the Indo Pacific. But you can hear it much more poignantly in the moving tributes to Mr. Abe from leaders like Prime Minister Modi, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott of Australia, who speak not only of a man who they respected and listened to in terms of his strategic vision, but deeply admired as a human being. It's a very moving, very sad moment for Japan and for Abe-san's many, many friends. And I consider myself one. I worked with him when I was in the White House. I studied and met with him throughout my career. It's a sad moment, but it's also an important moment to reflect on what a powerful legacy he had for Japan, how much he transformed Japan's relations with India, with the United States, with Australia, and how much of a vision and really a compass he has left for the rest of us as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To begin the discussion, and I will call upon Foreign Minister Jaishankar to deliver his first remarks, and thank you for accepting our invitation at such short notice. Over to you.
Friends and colleagues, we are gathered here in tribute to former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe a few weeks after his tragic assassination. It's natural that on an occasion like this, we would be sharing our recollections, exchanging memories. But I think if we are to do him justice, it's important to evaluate his contribution not just to his own country's security and foreign policy and development, but actually to international relations over the last 30 years. Since I have known him for some years, I would actually like to begin by sharing some of those memories. And I first went to Japan in 1996. I don't honestly remember when I met at that time the Member of Parliament Shinzo Abe, but it would have been very soon after that. I think he was first elected to Parliament in 1993. But I do remember him much more clearly in 2000. He was then Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary in the Mori government, and Prime Minister Mori actually paid a visit to India, which was trying to get past the difficulties in which the relationship found itself after our nuclear test. And as part of the preparations for that, he actually told us that Mr. Abe would be handling some sensitive aspects of that visit, which actually Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretaries generally do in Japan. And that's my really first vivid recollection of him. Now, after that, I went off to Prague, and I then came to Delhi, and my next meeting with him was actually in Delhi. And he was then the acting Secretary General of the LDP, the Jiminto, and he had come with his wife on a private visit, and we met at the house of a common friend in Delhi. And I remember asking him, saying, who was he meeting? And I was surprised actually he was meeting nobody in the government. Because he felt it was a private visit, and he was a party person at that point of time. And I then asked through the then media advisor Sanjay Baru if the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, would receive him, and which the Prime Minister did the next morning. And later on, of course, I heard from Dr. Manmohan Singh that he was really. He said he was a very untypical Japanese in many ways, and Dr. Manmohan Singh had a very long association himself with Japan, so there must have been a lot of data there in his mind to make that comparison. Now, Mr. Abe, of course, then became the Chief Cabinet Secretary. He became Prime Minister in 2006. But he developed a very strong interest in India around that period. And one of the expressions of that interest was actually to encourage us to do a trilateral. And the previous speaker, Mike Green, who you all heard, was then working in the White House as senior director. So I was then the head of department, the joint secretary for the US. So we worked together to put this trilateral together, and some people who are in the trilateral are sitting in the podium on the stage along with me. Of course, one of the challenges of those times, we used to say, was in any gathering with Japan, how to get the Japanese talking and how to get the Indians to stop talking was a very major challenge, but somehow we managed to get past it, perhaps with some degree of American intermediation. From there, actually 2005, 2006, 2007, this relationship grew steadily, the India-Japan one. And the India-Japan one had Mr. Abe's sort of fingerprints all over it, really, for the next 15 years. I mean, if there was one relationship which he singularly, personally, very devotedly transformed, in office, out of office, different offices he held, this was it. Now, in 2007, of course, we attempted the first Quad at his encouragement. But interestingly, this was the period I got to know him better myself. I was then in Singapore, still working on the nuclear deal. And he was extremely interested in how the nuclear deal was progressing, because he understood intuitively that this was something much bigger, that this was actually India-US relationship, which was on the cusp of a very big change. And from about 2007, I would say, I was almost on a regular basis in touch with him. He was, of course, not Prime Minister for about 5 years at that period, but we still, every time I went to Japan, and I would go at least once or twice a year, I would see him. He was very, again, when I was in China, after that, it was something I used to stop by to see him in Tokyo, and we would often discuss what was happening in Asia. And of course, once he resumed his prime ministership in 2012, and from 2015, when I came back to Delhi, I had the privilege of seeing him on a number of official occasions. The last time, actually, I saw him was just a few weeks ago. This was the day after the Quad meeting in Tokyo. So he had come to meet Prime Minister Modi because he was taking over the chairmanship, the presidency of the Japan-India Association from Prime Minister Modi. It was again a very warm, very forward-looking conversation, and even now it's very firmly etched in my mind. Now, that's the personal recollection bit. But if I were to step back a little bit and ask myself, and I think all of you should ask yourselves as well, what set Shinzo Abe apart? Why do we think of him differently than we do of other leaders of our times? And I can think of a number of reasons. One, I think more than any other Japanese politician I met, and I've met quite a few in the last 25 years, I think he saw the big picture. He was a very strategic person. He understood the uncertain world which was emerging in the first decade of this century. I think much more, with much greater insight and intuition than many of his contemporaries. Now, along with that, I also think he understood that Japan's relationship with the world was changing, that a lot of what his predecessors and he himself perhaps could take for granted in previous decades, this may no longer be possible in the coming years. So I think that appreciation of a changing world, the difficulties which and the challenges it presented, I think is something which perhaps he got much better in a gut sense than many others. The third, of course, was our own region, and particularly, I think Mike Green pointed out his conceptualization of the Indo Pacific. I mean, it was a subject which had been sort of somewhere up in the air, but he crystallized it. I think that was something. It was visible in his address to the Indian Parliament on the confluence of the seas, but this whole first, the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific, the idea that we cannot plan or think in a compartmentalized way, and that the post-1945 world had started to run its course and something different was happening. I think that was something which he understood, and he strategized on that basis. Now, when he strategized on that basis, two things happened. One, he obviously came to the conclusion that we needed cooperative arrangements for in a new arena, in a new landscape with possibly new players, or at least players with different weight, and which is why very early on, we are looking at 2006, 2007, he had this idea of a Quad working arrangement. The second, of course, was that he also understood that the missing piece in this strategy was actually India and Japan. That by that time, he could see that India-US had started to transform. Japan itself had, Japan, Australia, and the US are linked to varying degrees by treaty relationships. But it was really getting India right, or getting the India relationship right, which was really very central to the changes that he conceptualized and the response to those changes. So I do think the more he dealt with us, we had a very special place in his mind and in his heart. But I think we had a special place in his strategy as well. That for him, India, developing a very strong connect between India and Japan was really the part of the foundation of creating a free and open Indo-Pacific. I still, when I think back of the many conversations I had with him, it was interesting. Once he said this to me when I was in China, that he found it interesting to talk to us, because as a country with a very different political strategic position, which was his polite way of saying that we were not a treaty ally, we had insights and perspectives that he found very interesting, and that he often didn't find that in the peer group in which he was operating at that time. So clearly, I could see over a long period, over 15 years plus, that he actually found in our conversations ideas and suggestions which helped him to plan Japan's own responses. At a sort of political cultural level, I think Prime Minister Abe again was a person. He was intensely Japanese. Anybody who knew him and dealt with him would say that. But that reconciliation, the harmony of modernity and tradition, which Japan generally embodies, but I think he did it in a much more intense way, in a much more personal way. And I think he appreciated others who did it too. So a lot of his, to my mind, having sat in on a lot of his meetings with Prime Minister Modi, I think a common point that they had was this ability really to be very, very, this modernity tradition dichotomy, how they bridged it, each one. And of the many memories I have, one which will always stay with me was, of course, Shinzo Abe at the banks of the Ganga River during Ganga Aarti. It was something which, he wasn't doing it out of, a desire to, because it was part of his program. I think he understood it for what it was. And if one look back, there are still videos of that ceremony. I mean, you can actually see that in the expression on his face and how he responds to it. So, in a sense, if we are to make a historical judgment about him, I would say, I mean, as an Indian, clearly, I would say that he's had a very unique role in developing and defining our contemporary relationship. And he took it to places which normally would have taken us years, if ever, to get there. I mean, the idea that within a few years we could be discussing a defense relationship with Japan, we could actually have a nuclear agreement with Japan, that there'd be a bullet train project with Japan. I think a lot of this is really, was really Shinzo Abe himself at work. The second, of course, is that I think he did a lot, perhaps more than anybody else in his time, of making Japan ready for the challenges that await the world and await Japan. I think he's prepared his own society much more to deal with the difficulties and the complexities that characterize our current times. And third, of course, I do think that as a leader, a political leader of our times, he was one of the most forceful and one of the most effective in talking about values, in bringing values to the center of political debate and international diplomacy. And my own sense is that in the coming days, all of us will increasingly recognize why it is important to look at the world, to understand the importance of a rule-based order constructed on shared democratic values. So once again, I would like to thank you, Indrani, for the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Our next speaker is actually sitting in New Zealand, and it is almost midnight there. But Prime Minister Tony Abbott of Australia, who also had a very close relationship with Shinzo Abe, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today. May I turn over to you, please?
To be here and to be speaking in such company. As Minister Jaishankar just said, what was it that set Shinzo Abe apart? I think the difference between Shinzo Abe and so many other contemporary leaders is that he didn't just hold office, he made a difference. He was, as Mike Green said earlier, by far the most consequential Japanese statesman of recent times. Now, when I was Prime Minister, I was accustomed to begin my first meeting with overseas leaders by saying something that I believed was profoundly true and that I knew they'd want to hear. So when I first met Shinzo Abe as Prime Minister back in late 2013, I told him that no one should hold Japan's history against it and use it as a weapon against Japan, because since 1945, Japan had been an absolutely exemplary international citizen. Incidentally, at my first meeting with Narendra Modi, I congratulated him on being the leader of the world's, quote, emerging democratic superpower, and went on to say how much we absolutely needed another democratic superpower. Now, at the East Asia Summit in Burma in 2014, I was part of a group of 4 leaders at a break in proceedings where China's Premier Li Keqiang was very vigorously upbraiding Abe's son over Japan's war record, even to the point of quite literally poking him in the chest. I very loudly interrupted by saying to the 4th in this group, the Sultan of Brunei, how much must he have hated the British for what they did to his country. And I managed to use the interruption to then say to Li Keqiang, look, history is a good teacher, but it's a very bad master. And Abe's son was good enough to recall this particular incident in a tribute video that was played at an event in Canberra just about 10 days ago, most poignantly a few days after his death. Early on in my time as PM, I called Japan, quote, Australia's best friend in Asia, unquote. And this caused a bit of a minor diplomatic contretemps. And the challenge for Abe-san was, would he repeat it and annoy the Chinese, or would he fail to repeat it and embarrass me? In fact, with the typical aplomb, Abe-san transcended it and got me out of a diplomatic hole by describing the relationship between Australia and Japan as, quote, a special relationship, unquote, and all of you would know just what that means in terms of the relations between countries. Now, in 2007, in his first stint as Prime Minister, Abe-san made a famous speech which Minister Jaishankar has just alluded to the Indian Parliament, where he talked about the confluence of the two seas. This was really the start of the concept of the Indo Pacific as a high-level international concept. It was also the start of the Quad. As we know, the Quad subsequently languished, only to be revived by Abe-san and Prime Minister Modi via a meeting on the margins of the East Asian Summit in Manila in late 2017. And subsequently, the Quad has gone from strength to strength, most recently with leader-level meetings. Now, many people have had a hand in the Quad. Obviously, India's Prime Minister Singh, President George W. Bush and subsequent American presidents, Australian Prime Ministers Howard, Turnbull and Morrison. I certainly talked to Narendra Modi about the Quad in my time as Prime Minister. But only someone of Abe-san's strategic insight and longevity of tenure could have overcome, in my view, India's traditional non-alignment, its self-sufficiency and its detachment from affairs beyond its immediate neighbourhood to make the Quad happen. And in this, of course, Narendra Modi was Abe-san's absolutely essential partner. Now, because in a very real way, Shinzo Abe was the father of the Quad, and because the Quad has been by far the most important geostrategic development since the establishment of NATO, that makes Abe-san one of the contemporary world's very greatest statesmen. And I think it's most fitting that Prime Minister Modi, who described Shinzo Abe as one of his very dearest friends, should have declared a national day of mourning in India on his death. I'd like to congratulate this institute for holding this event. I'm honoured to be taking part of it. I feel I'm in absolutely wonderful company, and I hope events like this might make the people of Japan realise just what a very special man Shinzo Abe was, and make them better appreciate exactly what they've lost. I think he was a remarkable man, absolutely remarkable man. The whole world is poorer for his passing, but immensely the richer for his living.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you very much for those remarks. My next speaker should be at work, but Kurt Campbell, the Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Indo Pacific Affairs at the White House National Security Council, has been very kind to stay back for a little while to deliver his remarks for today's event. Thank you so much, Mr. Campbell, and over to you.
No, thank you. It's actually my honor to be with you today, and I'm so grateful that you have brought us all together to remember a man who's made an enormous contribution to global peace and stability and to Asian strategy. We've already heard from so many terrific speakers, from the foreign minister, from the former prime minister, and I'm grateful to join my voice in basically seconding everything that they have said. I would just add a few things, if I might. I had the great benefit of engaging former Prime Minister Abe as we sought to take the Quad to the leader level. And what I really admired about him, which is unique for many leaders, he was audacious, he was bold, and he was entrepreneurial. And so when we engaged with him and asked what the attitudes that we would likely engage in varying countries, said you need to push, and you need to put this on the map. And he was a strong cheerleader for the Quad, but not just a cheerleader of the Quad in Japan, a cheerleader of the Quad in each of our countries. He recognized the unique role that Japan, that Australia, that India, and the United States played together, and recognized that our four maritime democracies, our voices and our potential were magnified when we worked together. And so very grateful for that encouragement. We look back now over the last month, year or so, and it seems just natural that the leaders meet and engage, but that is not the case. It was very difficult, lots of bureaucratic hurdles, lots of uncertainty in various capitals, and he was unhesitatingly supportive and strong in his support of that initiative. Second, one of the other things that I think other speakers will comment upon is Prime Minister Abe's role in ensuring Japan's vision and engagement in Southeast Asia. He had a very strong vision for Southeast Asia, both as a grouping as part of ASEAN, but also the individual states. In many respects, he is the modern father of a tremendously diverse and strong relationship between Japan and Vietnam, and he recognized the importance of Southeast Asia as swing states in the global competition. Lastly, if I can just say just a few things about the Prime Minister personally. One of the things that's interesting about him when he was in and out of power, many people at that level basically adhere to just a rigorous hierarchy. They would never think of seeing people below a certain rank. They insist on certain kinds of protocols. Prime Minister Abe was not that way. He knew who his friends were. He knew who were the people that he'd worked with over years. If he thought you had something interesting or important to say, he would make time for you. And I try to remember that and try to recognize that very important personal quality in terms of how he engaged people on their merits, not just on their status. The other thing that was striking to me is that he loved life. And he loved things that were Japanese. He would very much enjoy going out to dinner with you, and he would explain why this cut of beef or that piece of sushi was unique and wonderful. And he loved Japanese beer, and he enjoyed very much the wonderful things of life, sharing a meal and a conversation. He had a great sense of humor, a big personality. He truly was a great man, and a man whose vision is defining and will go down as one of the great strategists and statesmen of the 21st century, not just in Asia, but the world. And so I join all of us, and I see so many friends. One of the great things that you've done tonight, wherever we all are, is that you've brought all of us together, all of us who share strong personal associations and a deep sense of gratitude and respect for all that he accomplished for Japan and on the international stage. So I thank you for this opportunity. It's terrific to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Campbell. I know you have to run off, so I'm going to make a quick exception and ask one tiny second question. Okay.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, which is, in your view, how do you see the future of the Indo-Pacific and the kind of legacy of Shinzo Abe that you can put forward?
If I can say, I am optimistic about the Indo-Pacific, but it faces very clear challenges. But I will say the other thing that other speakers will comment on, which is a quality of Prime Minister Abe that we should all keep in mind. When faced with almost any challenge, he was optimistic. He sought to be optimistic, had a positive frame of reference, sought to continually move forward. And I think we all face days where it's difficult to remember that and sometimes to carry it off in your personal or professional life. Prime Minister Abe always put that sense of forward momentum on full display, and I'm very grateful for that. And I think that defining feature and quality helped Allied and other nations find the confidence to work together in a difficult age.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell, and I know you have to run, so thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker was actually one of Prime Minister Abe's closest advisors. Tom Taniguchi helped him write some of his most important speeches and literally thought for him. So, Tom, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Indrani. And thank you very much, Taran, for giving me this very much important opportunity to speak in honor of our beloved Prime Minister Abe. Each morning, I wake up and realize that Prime Minister Abe is not with us anymore. The next moment, I find myself in disbelief that the sun still rises. A new day dawns. The sky can be clear, and another day begins for me, despite that Prime Minister Abe is no longer here on our planet. It feels as if, since that momentous Friday, the 8th of July, we have been in an unreal, parallel world. There must be another universe where Prime Minister Abe is still alive. I have dropped not even a single drip of tears thus far. I am tremendously sad and angry. Angry because he could have been alive and with us if the totally avoidable crime could indeed have been avoided. The second nature I have developed over the last 10+ years, that whatever catches my attention, be it an aspiring young female officer with the Defense Forces, or be it even a hit song of which lyrics sound encouraging for the nation's youth, the next moment I think of him, Prime Minister Abe. That's my second nature, and it will not easily go away. I will live with that habit of mind, only to feel emptier still. He was a born strategic thinker, a proud patriot. He was also unashamedly realistic when tackling challenges that Japan is faced with. He represented the first post-war generation of the Japanese, for whom the presence of the United States forces on the soil of Japan was nothing but political assets rather than liabilities. It was hence self-evident for him that there is no alternative for Japan's future except for ever strengthening the US-Japan military alliance. The central theme of the 40-minute address he delivered in English, April 2015, to the Joint House of the US Congress, was to recalibrate the alliance from the one that worked as an umbrella with which Japan weathered the Cold War era to the one Japan and the United States must work together to develop as a beam, sturdy enough to sustain the big roof that covers the entire Indo Pacific region, robust enough to deter China from resorting to military assaults. He knew that there must at least be two more pillars that sustain the big roof. One was India, and another, Australia. That is why Mr. Abe, despite his chronic illness of ulcerative colitis then worsening, gave an address to the Joint House of the Indian Parliament, August 2007, under the duly chosen title of Confluence of the Two Seas, which would replace Asia Pacific with Indo Pacific. Soon after he came back in office, helped by the strong bond he developed with Prime Minister Abbott, he flew to Canberra and addressed the Joint House of the Australian Parliament. So created was the security diamond, to quote from the title of his article he published for Project Syndicate soon after coming back in office, which is to be called Quad later. The quadrilateral framework for him meant a network of democratic security providers, no less. It is a two-dimensional concept as it covers the vast stretch of sea surfaces from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. It is also a three-dimensional framework, for it is expected that the four democracies put together military industrial capabilities as well as scientific knowledge each country develops to better rule the airspace as well as outer space. Finally, it is also a four-dimensional concept as it envisages that long-term time must be on the side of democratic powers. When Japan lost Prime Minister Abe, the nation also lost the ever-shining pole star. We are suddenly deprived of a compass that never wavered. Weakness invites Chinese provocations. One must take note. Japan must stay on the trajectory Prime Minister Abe worked hard to build, one that brings us all together from India, Australia, and the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. My next speaker would be Mr. John Hamre, President and CEO of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., a very close friend of Shinzo Abe and, of course, of the Ananta Center and India. Mr. Hamre.
Thank you, President Bagchi, and thank you for organizing this very important tribute to a great man. I'm very grateful to be included. Henry Kissinger recently released his 19th book, and I apologize that I have to leave a bit early because I'm joining him at 9 o'clock. But at the age of 99, he still is a vibrant intellect. This book is entitled Leadership: 6 Studies in World Strategy. The preface to these individual chapters, these studies, is a superb short essay on the essential challenges of being a leader. Abe Shinzo was not one of the 6 case studies. They came from different generations. But this little essay is the backdrop from which I'm thinking about Abe Shinzo today. You know, in this preface, Henry writes that leaders think and act at the intersection of 2 axes. The first, between the past and the future, and the second, between the abiding values and the aspirations of those they lead. Abe-san came to office with a very deep, rich political consciousness. You know, his grandfather was a prime minister. But when he came to office, he saw that Japan was in a deep state of ambivalence. You know, India doesn't question its greatness. The United States doesn't question its greatness, but Japan was questioning its greatness. Japan had endured over 20 years of economic stagnation following the great asset bubble burst, you know, the 1970s. A generation of politicians and business leaders had matured during that time of stagnation. It affected their consciousness about the nature of Japanese society and its possibilities. Even though Japan was the 2nd largest economy in the world, Japanese leaders saw themselves as a middle power, constrained by a sputtering economy and the legacy of shame from World War II. Abe Shinzo knew that he had to address that subconscious ambivalence if he was going to restore a sense of direction, momentum, and pride, you know, in Japanese leadership circles. His strategy was animated by breaking free from the constraints of Japan's early post-war reconstruction. Abe-san felt he had to address the humiliating constitution that was forced on Japan by the United States at the end of World War II. He did want to amend the Constitution, but he had to settle for reinterpreting Article 9 of the Constitution. In the process, however, he fundamentally restructured Japan's government as it approaches national security. He created a new and more dynamic decision-making system in the Kantai. He lifted up the Japanese Defense Force. He pushed to change the legal framework to allow Japanese forces to participate internationally in a complete way, as a full partner, not just as a supporting actor. Abe-san had a sophisticated understanding of the modern world. He knew the remarkable rise of China created a new reality, one that required a redefinition of Japan's alliance with the United States. It also required a far more active foreign policy that made Japan a crucial partner in an evolving informal political structure in Asia. Informal political structure in Asia. Japan had to craft a strategy of reassurance in the face of a rising China without triggering a damaging and hostile competition with China. One of his, I think, towering achievements was the creation of the Japan-India-US dynamic, this trilateral dynamic. It embodied the core of his strategy to make Japan a partner, a full partner in a network of leaders that shared a concern about managing these challenges of a dynamic, rising China. Yes, honestly, you know, his actions and his ideas did bring to the surface some unresolved historical tensions with Korea and China. That too remains a legacy of his leadership and is something now that we're all trying to address. But Japan is now a full partner in every sense of the word. When America was faltering at the conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade program, Abe-san stepped forward. He brought it to fruition. When the Trump administration projected a wobbly inconsistency, Japan solidified the network of partnerships under the banner of an open, transparent, mutually constructive Asia. The Osaka G20 summit, in my view, was the crowning achievement of Abe-san's strategic vision and his leadership. I'm now old and tired. I don't really have enough energy left for sadness. I have to save all of my energy for joy, for happiness. And I think back with a very grateful heart on the remarkable leadership that Abe Shinzo brought, not just to Japan, but also to America. He gave us a confidence at a time when we needed it, and he carried all of us through to a well-designed future where all of us succeed together. This is the lasting contribution that ensures Abe-san will be with us forever. Thank you for including me today.
Thank you, John. My second last speaker was just as close an advisor to Shinzo Abe. And we actually dragged him out of his vacation to speak to us today at this event. Aichi Hasegawa, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you. Mr. Hasegawa, can you hear us? Could you?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Firstly, I have to appreciate you organizing this very important event, and also the enable me to join this session, as well as the very memorial distinguished leaders. And as you mentioned, so also I have to touch upon my appreciation to Dr. Hamre, CSIS. You had kindly organized for the coming back Prime Minister, Mr. Abe, the January of 2013, at the first very memorial conference, where Mr. Abe announced his Japan's back at the CSIS forum. And also, I also have to recall my appreciation to Prime Minister Abbott, who strongly encouraged Mr. Abe at the Davos summit. Again is January of 2014. Let me touch upon more details later, but Mr. Abe always shared the feeling, shared the sense of the value of Mr. Abbott, and also the both toward us. Tony is one of my best friend. Always, it's his mantra. And my collection started with Mr. Abe's sense of admiration and also respect. Of course, the affection towards country of India. And as a prime minister, besides the visit the Dr. Jaishankar touched upon earlier, as a prime minister, we visit the Delhi, of course, but also the Kolkata, where Mr. Abe liked to meet with the daughter of the granddaughter of Judge Pao, and the Varanasi, and where the Prime Minister Modi kindly invited Mr. Abe and his delegation. Mr. Abe confessed to me he was so astounded. Much more people on the street, very spontaneously, hoisting flag, and then shouting, "Welcome, Mr. Abe, to the Varanasi." That is a kind of feature of symbolism of democracy that India could boast greatly among others than any other countries in the world. And also he visited the Ahmedabad, where the very memorial bullet train project would be laid out later. And then that means so many times he liked to visit among the busy schedule of the Diet of Japan to visit. And in the meantime, Indian leaders and Mr. Abe and Japanese leaders agreed to visit counterpart, alternate manner every year, and also different from other countries' case. Mr. Abe and agreed with Mr. Modi and Dr. Manmohan Singh to take with him the Japanese business leader. And so whenever we visit the Delhi, and then whenever the Indian leaders visit Tokyo, business leaders had also the very meaningful discussion, and then try to wrap up their announcement, declaration, and also the drawings, maps for the future business development. And then it's a custom for two business leaders of two countries to submit the agreement to two prime ministers at the same time. And so also, I like to emphasize where is the base of Mr. Abe's sense of respect toward India. Of course, it's the country with the biggest democracy, but also Mr. Abe was so impressed with the Judge Pao, who criticized the kind of a court organized by the victorious countries just after the Second World War. It is not court. So therefore, Judge Pao took the unique position as that court that impressed many Japanese people, a symbol of impartiality, the justice and the fairness. And so Mr. Abe, I think probably he was also taught by his grandfather, but he always emphasized to us, India is a country, not only the democracy, but also the country of fairness. So that's why he visited the Kolkata, and the Prime Minister Modi also, when he visited Japan, he find his precious time and visited not only Tokyo, but also the other important venue of Japan, one of which is the city of Kobe, very famous the port big city with lots of Indian origin population, where the two prime ministers visit the factory of Kawasaki heavy industry, where the bullet train was built. And also when Mr. Abe visited Mr. Modi to his villa at the foot of Mount Fuji, as someone mentioned earlier, is two gentlemen visit the factory of Fanuc. Fanuc is the global most competitive robotics companies. And so it's, how can I say, the symbolized kind of hybrid of IT and manufacturing, modern manufacturing, which would enhance, promote the productivity, which is the critical element for future industry. So that means is the India and Japan, thanks to the leaders, many people could expand their area of the exchange and the communication and the friendship. So a student and the tourist and more and more people started visit. When Mr. Abe started, my understanding, according to my understanding, his the stepping up his stake and the investing his political capital is that was late 90s, when the a so-called political crisis assailed Japan and India, or because the Japan strongly criticized nuclear weapons experimentation of both India and China. But unfortunately, then Japanese government they treated two countries in different manner. So therefore, if I dare to say, is Indian peoples and leaders may be disappointed, may have been disappointed against Japan's such kind of treatment. So therefore, someone has to fill that politics vacuum. Otherwise, Japan would miss the very important friends, gigantic country with gigantic potentiality. So in that atmosphere, under the leadership of Mr. Mori, Mr. Abe took initiative, his own initiative, and pitched his own political capital based upon his very profound, deep, discovered his respect is triggered by Judge Pao toward India. Sometimes Japan is criticized by the few Asian countries. I suppose they would like to politically exploit the history more than half century ago. So in that context, when Mr. Abe visited the Davos, January of 2014, not only those Asian countries, but also some European countries also gagged up to test Mr. Abe, saying that year of the 100 years anniversary of First World War. Mr. Abe, of course, didn't mention anything about that. Rather, he characterized the bilateral relationship between Japan and China as a strategical, mutually profitable relationship. But those peoples, including the media, didn't accept his argument. So in such, how can I say, the forum, Mr. Abbott kindly, Prime Minister Abbott kindly found his time and came to Mr. Abe. And then, Abe-san, if I am wrong, please correct me. But the thrust of Mr. Abbott, the statement to Mr. Abe is, Abe-san, now is you're correct. So therefore, that convinced Mr. Abe is even the world of democracies, leaders, there's leaders who correctly understand what had happened, what is happening, what would the future would be. So therefore, in one sense, he's so satisfied with the so many friends surrounded by United States, Australia, and India. So therefore, my sense is the so-called Quad is a kind of logical consequence of Mr. Abe's philosophy. And then one day when I visited Delhi, I was so lucky to sit beside Prime Minister Modi. And so therefore, I was so lucky to chat with the Indian leader personally. And then I questioned him that which global leader you like best? Prime Minister Modi's reaction is Mr. Abe. I asked him why. He is a guy, he's a leader of the inspiring. Many global leader, world leader, is very good at laying out the vision and the commitment. But in case of Mr. Abe, not only just presenting his vision, but also he would make that happen. So therefore, and then after that, he tried to challenge next agenda. So according to the Prime Minister Modi, not only just articulating something, but also wrapping up and make something happen. And then that is so inspired Mr. Modi. That is Mr. Modi's impression. Firstly, I'm so happy, of course, but I'm also the Indian leader is again so fair, superimposed by the image from the Judge Pao. So finally, this time is before that Japan decide we would hold the national condolence ceremony in there already, the formally extended sense of condolence for the sake of the Prime Minister Abe. And also recently, if my understanding is correct, is United Senate also they made a resolution for the Prime Minister Abe for the praising his the achievement.
Thank you,
so, okay, well, let me finish in a few words. So that is final my answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My last speaker for this evening is actually not the least, but somebody with a long history of both building a relationship with Japan as well as building a relationship with Shinzo Abe. Tarun Das, founder trustee of the Ananta Center. He's a co-chair of the India-Japan Strategic Dialogue and the chairman of the Sasakawa International Leprosy Foundation. Mr. Das.
Thank you very much. All of you have heard from two persons, eminent persons, our foreign minister and Dr. Kurt Campbell, who work for their governments, and the others who have worked for their governments at some time or the other in their careers, and usually for long periods. I'm the only non-government employee at any time in my life. So what am I doing here? I had the good fortune to be spending my life, working life, with an unique organization called the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII. And CII doesn't believe that its work stops with business. CII always believed that its work goes beyond the boundaries of business. And so in 2006, when the then Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, reached out to me and said that we need to take an initiative with Japan, as you people had done with the US and the Aspen Strategy Group. We want to build a deeper relationship. Can you take an initiative? And I turned, at that time, I had already become a founder trustee of Ananta Center, I retired from CII. I turned to CII, the Director General, and to the Washington office of CII, headed by Kiran Pastrija, who is here. And the road to Tokyo led through Washington, D.C. It led through Mike Green, who you've heard, and it led through people like Kurt Campbell, who we were working with on the US-India Strategic Dialogue. Kurt was actually directing that dialogue at that time with us. From 2006 till now, we started as a trilateral, US, India, Japan. It evolved into a bilateral of Japan and India, with US, India meeting separately. Every single meeting, we were able to meet Prime Minister Abe, I as Prime Minister, or occasionally when he was not Prime Minister. And we would always meet whoever was the Prime Minister in Japan. We had an incredible co-chair from Japan, Mr. Kasai, who has passed away recently. And the story, the fairy tale that we really achieved in these years with Mr. Abe and Mr. Kasai was that they wanted to build a strong Japan. They wanted Japan to play a larger role in the world. And they wanted India's deep and strong partnership. And they were wanting this with people who were not in government. They were wanting a track-to process to help the relationship to grow and all of us growing together. In 2007, when he came and addressed our parliament, he spoke about broader Asia. And as Tom said, he spoke about the confluence of the two seas. And today you see Indo Pacific, you see IPEF, you see the Quad, all of which has been mentioned earlier. And all these things he would talk to us and say, you also reinforce this process. You also put your shoulder to the wheel. And motivated us, inspired us to do more and more to build the bilateral relationship and to build beyond that. He was an amazing man for us. He was the first person who told us, much to our surprise and a little bit to our, we were not sure whether this was the right thing to do, because we were working US, India, Japan very closely. He said, please include Australia. We had concerns. We were not sure whether to include Australia, but it was Abe-san who pointed us to the southern hemisphere. He pointed us to bring in Australia as a democracy into this group. Man of amazing foresight, and as Kurt Campbell said, it doesn't matter what your rank is, it doesn't matter who you are. If you have something to say, if you have something to contribute, he's got time for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Das. As you saw, we ran through a dizzying array of speakers. Let me begin a question. Let me ask Minister Jaishankar a question, since we cannot actually let you go without answering extra questions. A similar question that I asked to Kurt Campbell, which is, given Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's legacy, what do you see as the future of the Indo-Pacific, and how do you see the shaping of this strategic concept?
Well, I think Kurt spelled it out quite clearly. In fact, I think to varying degrees, I think Prime Minister Abbott also, in a sense, gave part of that answer, which is that, to me, Shinzo Abe's legacy, one, of course, is, as I said, he prepared his own country for more turbulent times. But he's actually, in a sense, I would say, reconstructed international relations. After all, how many prime ministers can you say who really reimagined the strategic arena? I mean, here's a prime minister who's actually thought of Indo Pacific, made it happen during his tenure in office, who imagined a different way of working. Quad, the first attempt in 2007, the second attempt in 2017. And the Quad is really quite interesting. I mean, in the sense, if you see, it's very different from anything which contemporary international relations had thrown up till then. It doesn't have a paper people signed up to. It doesn't have a secretariat. It actually has very little other than a common intent. And it's, in that sense, it's a very novel concept of how countries actually work together. It's interesting that when we had, once that took off in the Indo-Pacific, actually 2 of the Quad participants also saw a value of doing something similar in the Middle East. So I point to Quad not really as a one-off. I mean, I want, particularly so many diplomats in the room, I think it's really worth thinking about how he thought of a different way of working. But a few points which others made, I think, are definitely worth reiterating. To my mind, he was a great realist, and it was his realism which actually led him to take a lot of these initiatives over a period of time. I think he was also very practical and pragmatic, practical not in the sense of cutting deals or transactions. Practical in the sense that he realized that unless you had very strong bilateral relations, saying that we would work together collectively would not have that much meaning. You know, the Quad would not have happened. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, why did the Quad work in 2017 and not in 2007? And to my mind, the answer is in 2007, our bilateral relationships among the four of us weren't in place. They weren't at the right level. Between 7 and 17, in that decade, I think our relationships, those relationships really intensified and developed. And here, particularly India was the outlier among the four. I would credit Prime Minister Abbott with really changing India-Australia relationship. In the case of the US, I think successive presidents did that. But it really required, on the one hand, somebody like Prime Minister Modi on the Indian side who was prepared to do something big, do it with conviction, do it without hesitation. So there wasn't, any wobbliness about it that, I'm doing it, but I'm hedging it. Most of all, I would credit Prime Minister Abe, because that's, getting those relations in place then allowed this to actually happen in 2017. And here's a person like Robert Bruce who kept trying and trying until he actually got it right.
Thank you, Mr. Jaishankar. Prime Minister Abbott, if I may address you, what is it that you saw in the India-Australia relationship that needed to be fixed? And I ask this because I know that your predecessors, certainly John Howard, etc., had done their bit, but there was a point at which the relationship became a strategic one. What point was that, and what were you thinking about?
Well, I was lucky in that I'd spent 3 months in India back in 1981 as a student on my way to England. And I had this long fascination with India. But if I could go back to Shinzo Abe just for a moment, you see, Abe grasped that the big problem for the modern world was illiberal, undemocratic China, and that the essential answer to every question about China was democratic, liberal India. That's what Shinzo Abe grasped. And he also appreciated that to help to preserve a free and democratic world, Japan was going to have to step up and play its rightful role as the leading democracy of the Western Pacific. So this is the genius of Shinzo Abe, and we're all very lucky that in Narendra Modi, Shinzo Abe found such a willing, imaginative, brave and bold partner. And I certainly think that Abe and Modi are probably two of the most significant statesmen of recent times. So, look, to get back to Australia and India, we're two countries which have always had a lot in common, but for a long period of time we didn't have much to do with each other. That was the problem. John Howard appreciated that we needed to do more with India, but I think it was quite late in his term that he really got around to it. I certainly wanted to make much more of the India relationship from the very beginning, and I am pleased that with a little bit of an interruption, all subsequent Australian Prime Ministers have taken that same view.
Thank you, Prime Minister Abbott. We are almost out of time, but I'm going to give the last word to Tom Taniguchi. How do you see, not only the Indo Pacific, but the India-Japan relationship, Tom, in a post-Abe era?
Well, I have to say, as Tarandas said, there are very much important two individuals to make all this happen: Prime Minister Abe and Yoshiyuki Kasai. These two gentlemen were amazing, and they were always on the same page when it comes to the importance of involving, as Prime Minister Abe has just said, as a very much important counterweight against illiberal China. These two gentlemen are now no longer with us. As an anecdote, let me just introduce Mr. Kasai did not receive any visitor to his sickened bed, but it was only Shinzo Abe who was allowed to visit him on his bedside, not only once, but 3 times. It showed who Shinzo Abe really was. He was a man of everlasting friendship. And India-Japan relationship came to where it is, helped and boosted by these individuals. Taran Das, Armitage, John Hamre, all those people played an important part. But luckily, we've got an institutionalized Quad mechanism, which is clearly a legacy of Prime Minister Abe. So each and every year, the leaders of 4 democratic nations gather and put steam onto the mechanism and give grease to the wheels. Let's just hope that Quad will last and stand tall in the coming years, because, as we all know, the next 5 years is going to be crucial. In 2027, Xi Jinping is going to have to face another contest. In 2027, PLA is going to celebrate its centenary. From now until 2027, East Asia, East China Sea, South China Sea are going to be very much intensely a contested area. We all are children, in a way, of Shinzo Abe, and let's just hope that the institution that he helped create is going to last.
Thank you, Tom. The absolute last word I'm going to give to Mr. Das.
One minute, not even that. The Track 2 dialogue that we've had since 2006, supported by Abe-san, led on the Japanese side by Kasai-san, both are gone, but their legacy lives on. Their friends and other institutions in Japan have come together. They want to continue the strategic dialogue with us, and our next meeting is in November in Japan. So we move on.
And on that note, thank you all very much for being here this evening, and it leaves only for me to say thank you and good evening. Thank you very much.